All right, welcome to another episode of the CTO Advisor podcast. We have a special guest online. I don't get to talk to many other folks from the management consulting arm of our industry, the big four, who do this really high level consulting. It's technical in nature, but we're talking about large strategic problems. I have with me my pleasure, Dave Linthicum, Chief Cloud Strategy Officer at Deloitte Consulting. Dave, welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
So, Dave, we were reminiscing, or at least I was reminiscing. You're in the throes of management consulting today, where you used to get to go to all kind of far flung places of the world, China, Australia. I'm assuming parts, every part of the U.S. to help folks with their strategy around IT technology. Today, we're going to talk about repatriation. But how's the travel these days?
Not as much, but it's coming back. Obviously, the airlines aren't cooperating in some instances. We have to get around those snafus. But consulting is, always going to be a traveling profession. So it's coming back slowly, but it's going to be coming back.
So we've had plenty of conversations over the past few years in the industry around repatriation. We're not going to debate like, is there repatriation or should you repatriate or the level of activity? The simple fact is that there's a use case for it. And let's talk about first, you being a management consultant, let's talk about the business value. What are some of the considerations that's driving repatriation?
Yeah, I think it comes down to looking at a workload and a data set's ability to bring value back to the business on the cloud versus on a traditional system or even on a private cloud, and looking at what those metrics are. And so, what happened during, and certainly this happened during the pandemic, is people had a mad dash into the clouds. In other words, they moved lots of workloads, lots of lifting and shifting went on, lots of data, data set movements, things like that. Now they're getting the bills, and now that we have a lot of FinOps in place and cost observability, they're seeing the fact that this is a lot more expensive than it was on my traditional system. So let's take a look at this and reevaluate if I'm going to have a better deal or bring more value back to the business by moving it back to a similar system, hopefully operating them cheaper. And usually the hardware and software is going to be cheaper, or leaving it in the cloud. And even looking at the soft benefits of agility and flexibility and all the abilities that come along with the cloud, versus some of the limitations that's going to be there in moving it back on premise that we know, having dealt with the cloud for the last 15 years, what those are. But in some instances, not all, it's going to make more economic sense to put this workload or put this data set back on a more traditional system in a traditional data center and traditional operations than it is to leave them in the cloud. And those are the kind of problem domains that we're seeing right now.
So I know it's hard to have a conversation with two people that's historically been on the management consulting side because more than any other part of the industry, the answer is really strongly it depends.
It
But
depends.
we'll try to resist our natural nature to answer it depends. What what are some of the characteristics of workloads that are appealing to people to bring back on prem?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it's going to be workloads that typically aren't localized for cloud native features. In other words, they're not bound to the security system on the public cloud provider. They're not dependent on the scaling system. They're not dependent on particular APIs. And so if you put a lot of money and time into building those kinds of systems or even refactoring applications that move to the cloud, those are going to have to be unfactored to put them back on premise. So you have to and so in many instances, by the time you do that, I think you're seeing the value in running those applications on the cloud and data sets on the cloud as it is. So those would be an instance of where it would, probably not make sense for it to move back in the cloud. Some things like if you're doing the same thing over and over again, in other words, you have a common system that just does the same typical patterns of processing. There's no dependency or no benefits in running on the cloud, then those may be a candidate for repatriation. Large amounts of data storage. You're doing large amounts of unstructured data storage on a public cloud provider, and you're getting a huge bill from that. Certainly, if you're doing a lot of egress and ingress in the cloud, then putting it back on premise may make good economic sense to the fact you could be paying 20% of what you're paying for in the cloud. And so yeah, avoiding the it depends thing, it's really just kind of looking at this from a business metrics perspective, and not and kind of taking off your technical hat. If you're going to debate open systems and cloud systems and agility and those sorts of things versus on-premise systems, that's not the argument you're looking to have. You're looking to say, well, we exist in IT to return value back to the business. How best can we do that? In some instances, it's going to be moving it back on premise where it's going to have more economic value.
So let's say we've made the financial decision that we're going to move back on premises. One of the things that I've read and I've heard and I've talked to people is that they've lost the skill set. They've lost this skill to manage on prem systems. Matter of fact, some people never had it. Repatriation isn't just about coming back on prem, but going on prem for the first time. There are companies that have been born in the cloud, that they've operated only in the cloud. What are some of the kind of high level considerations about restarting your on premises operations? Should I go out there and look for a place to break down and build a data center?
Yeah, I wouldn't put that on anybody. Um, I think really you consider that in the equation. And so, in other words, if I don't have the skills in house that are able to maintain these on-premise systems, then I have to look at what it's going to cost to obtain those skills. And if you know, and there's actually a diminishing number of people who do that stuff now. Everybody has reassessed and retrained in the cloud. So that could be a consideration. That may be a reason not to repatriate. So in other words, okay, we're going to save 20, 30% on these workloads and these data sets moving on back on premise, all in operating costs, things like that. But if we can't get the skills, you just don't do it. And by the way, people are making those decisions now. They're making architectural decisions not based on what technology is going to be best a breed for the particular problem they're looking to solve, but around what skills are able to obtain and maintain. And so that's going to be a core decision. And I think that's very important. It's probably a reason a lot of people aren't going to repatriate, because they don't have the ability to maintain those workloads, even though they're going to be cheaper to run.
So, this is something I think you're uniquely positioned to answer. As architects, we can look at these things and say, "Oh, this is an apple. It should go in the apple cart. This is a orange. It should go into the bin that I use to make orange juice." Simple decision. When the land is turned over and we say, "Oh, it's time to build to grow squash here," or whatever the case, as technical people, we can look at a situation and make that decision politically. If I sold the idea that 3 years ago we're going all in on cloud and the landscape changes, how do I begin to have that conversation with the C suite that, yes, 3 years ago that was the best situation, but we need to start to tap the brakes on our cloud rollout and think about keeping some of these data center assets or whatever the current infrastructure?
Yeah, it's all data driven. And so I would go to the board of directors, whoever this, C suite was. Hopefully you didn't make the decision and, declared everything's going in the cloud. That's obviously something you have to kind of look at as a wise choice. You have to look at everything goes into the proper cloud platform, whether it's cloud or not, and say we have new metrics. This is costing us more because of this, this, and this. And the reality is that the cloud environments, from a cost perspective, are a changing dynamic. And so, in other words, their prices are going to go up, and renegotiating enterprise contracts, things like that. And just like we have outsourcing and we have people delivering power and water into our houses and businesses, they may become less economically desirable if they change their thing. So I would go there and say, listen, look, based on these metrics, we may have an opportunity to save some money by moving some of the workloads, and it's typically going to be some, not all. And the data sets, back on premise, are moving it into a managed service provider or a colo provider. That's typically what people are doing now. They're renting the space, and we can save, say, $100,000 a month if we make this particular move. Now, if they come back and they say, "Well, you said we're all in cloud, you're contradicting yourself," that's a problem. And so, in many instances, you got to have the political will to really kind of make the assessment as to, I wouldn't say a mistake was made, but we need to look at this in a much more pragmatic way than we did 5 years ago and reevaluate some of the workloads. At the end of the day, it's kind of right sizing and it's tuning because we're not taking, the 500 workloads and the 20 petabytes of data that sits in the cloud and then relocating it back on premise. We're taking aspects of that. In other words, we're taking analytical database here is unstructured storage, file system storage, archival storage. These things are kind of boring systems that will run perfectly well on premise as they do in the cloud, and just making a decision that we're going to save money by pushing them back on premise. And I would have hopefully a compelling argument to make to the boards of directors and CEOs. And hopefully I, didn't make the decision or didn't declare that we're all in on cloud. That's something I wouldn't do personally. But it comes down to a business decision, just like moving your business from one building to another, from one city and state to another city and state based on tax advantages. Those kinds of business decisions are made all the time. It's really kind of no different.
Yeah, some people call it the hill to die on, etc. And I think this is a great example of our audience has a crossover. There's kind of the enterprise architect looking to aspire to become the CTO one day. And this is one of those political decisions that you have to get really good at. Like, is this worth spending political capital on? And when do you find that a decision like this is worth spending political capital? I'll harken back to an example that my audience is aware of. I had to make from an enterprise architecture perspective, I had to make the political decision that we're not going to move from HPUX to Linux for our SAP instance. The business had just gone through a really painful consolidation of SAP, and I would have had to ask our CFO to spend more political capital to go to HPUX from HPX to Linux. At the end of the day, I have to do the assessment. Do I want to spend my political capital on that transaction? Where does this fall along this conversation line?
Yeah, I don't think it's any different than in the scenario you just described. It's a great example, it's a great analogy. And I think the reality is you have to make a decision as to whether it's worth you to make this assertion, which, by the way, they won't expect. They're not expecting that you make this assertion and doing your duty as someone who's fiscally responsible for the business. And so that kind of depends on the person you are and who's making the thing. In many instances, these kind of audits and these kind of assessments around repatriation are going to be sponsored by the C levels and by the boards of directors, because they're kind of looking for an audit kind of to make sure that they're investing in the right platforms and that we're changing the platforms or optimizing them to be better at it. So I don't think there's a lot of political loss that can happen there depending on the organization. And so what you're doing is just saying that we're going to make some minor adjustments because that's what you're doing. You're moving aspects of systems. We're not doing a huge repatriation effort to save some money. But if people are going to, view that as something that's a negative, that's something you have to consider. You have to consider the culture of the organization. There's some organizations I worked with, I would have no problem going into the CEO's office and telling them we have to go ahead and make this change, even though it would be confusing to them in some instances. Others I wouldn't, because I would be summarily fired. And so you kind of have to make that decision unto yourself. And even for people in the organization, am I going to, maintain, their ability to work here and have a good working relationship with the company if they're part of the team that's suggesting this stuff. And so it's not just you, but you kind of have to use your head when you make those decisions. My my bet on this, at my advanced age, is you're there to return equity back to your return value back to the investors, people who own the company. However you want to do that, even if you're admitting to a mistake, I think that's worthy. I think that's just doing the right thing. Some people may disagree with that. So you put the data and the information in front of the people who are making the decision, recommend a course of action. They can either say yes or no. But in doing so, you're doing the right thing to the investors, the people who actually own the company. Well, that's the fiduciary responsibility at its essence.
So this is one of those things you can't get a certification for. This is just experience. This is now that I have 25 years of industry experience, I can look back and well, my manager told me 5 years in, Keith, that it takes 25 years to get 25 years of experience. I now better understand that. Last question. This is one is kind of a curveball for you, but I was going over my response for call for papers, and I was surprised to see that you submitted a response to the call for papers. There's this term, super cloud, meta cloud, distributed cloud, going on, and you've submitted a paper to talk about that. Preview that concept for us.
Yeah, it's fairly simplistic. If you think about it, we're trying to remove hybrid clouds and multi clouds are complex, and that's where people are running into the problems and operating them. So in other words, they become there's you go from a 1,000 services under management to 3,000 services under management. And by the way, we're not giving you more money to operate those systems. You can't hire more people, can't build more tools, things like that. So we have to figure some way to mediate that complexity. And one thing you can do, you can certainly, try to underwhelm the operations and end up making mistakes and having outages and things like that. Or think about more creative ways to do that. So the idea with Meta Cloud and SuperCloud, whatever you want to call it, is to build this loosely coupled cross cloud layer or cross hybrid cloud layer, however you want to do it, that is able to provide a central way to deal with security and operations and governance and data storage and data management. So we're not doing it in different ways on each individual system. Hybrid cloud it would be doing on the private cloud and the public cloud, or doing on the traditional system in the public cloud. Multi-cloud it would be doing on 5 different public clouds in different ways. We're implementing security 5 different times and data management 5 different times. And that's where the complexity comes in. We just can't keep enough people around to kind of maintain all of these moving parts to make it happen. So the idea, and by the way, it's an older architectural concept. The idea with Meta Cloud, Super Cloud, whatever you want to call it, is having this loosely coupled layer that sits above the clouds. By the way, they may run on particular cloud providers, but they're able to extend and reach out and communicate. They logically sit above the cloud providers, where we're trying to consolidate lots of different things into a single layer, thus reducing the complexity, thus allowing us to operate these systems at scale, and thus allowing, hopefully, to reduce the money it's going to cost to operate these things. At least that's the idea.
And then, as the outro, so to speak, for people that are not familiar with your work, you have a book coming out. Can you tell us about the book and when it will be released?
Yeah, in April, it's called Insider's Guide to Cloud Computing. It does discuss a lot of the topics we talked about on the show, but basically, it's looking at cloud in a pragmatic way. So, folks who are, trying to figure out how to make the right decisions can kind of get an insider's view because, I'm CTO, I worked on the product side and certainly the management consulting side, and all over the place in different technologies over time as to what they should be thinking about. And also some of the things I don't think other people are telling them. Certainly, we're not hearing it out there from the vendors in the technology community as much. So it's getting to what you should be thinking and how to think differently about using cloud providers and using them effectively.
Dave, I really appreciate you taking time out of your schedule to come and talk to us about cloud repatriation, not from that normal should or shouldn't we, but really detailed data. If people want to find out more about the CTO Advisor, you can find us on the web, thectoadvisor.com. You can follow me on Twitter at CTO Advisor. All of David's contact information will be in the show notes, and you can find that on thectoadvisor.com. Until the next episode of the CTO Advisor, I haven't said this in a while. Share the podcast with your wife, your husband, your grandma, your mother. Put it in their podcatcher. They will be pleased to know more about cloud repatriation. Talk to you next episode.